Giant disclaimer for the beginning of the video. This isn't about labeling anybody as bad. This isn't about moral high grounds, and this isn't an attempt to incite a witch hunt. This video is meant to shed light on pieces of Homestuck's troubled history that the people in adjacent fandoms to the current animated project might not know about. I feel like a lot of people aren't aware of what's been happening with Homestuck, or rather it as an intellectual property, or what Andrew Hussie has become known for since the comic's ending. I want to try and bridge the gap and make it so these issues aren't just known to Homestuck Doomer veterans like myself, they're also known to people who are fans of Toby Fox's work, people who are fans of Vivziepop's work, and anybody else that saw the trailer and got curious. This also isn't about fandom wank. We're all weirdos here and there's no nerd supremacy in my house. This also isn't about old tweets and questionable statements from creators. This is about real people's livelihoods and a corporation hell-bent on treating its own community lifeblood as expendable and unimportant. Part 1. Who is Homestuck? A lot of you probably know Homestuck as that weird internet comic no one is normal about, and you would be correct. However, Homestuck as the intellectual property has been owned by Homestuck the company for some time now. For the sake of brevity, I will be calling this Homestuck Corp from now on, and that's a gross oversimplification since there are several entities which changed names over the years that were directly under the supervision of Andrew Hussie, the creator of Homestuck. On the pilot crew poster that was released alongside the trailer, he's also credited as the writer and creator, which is concerning. The crew has other pretty notable figures, the ones the internet latched onto the most being Vivian Medrano, or Vivziepop, who's executive producer, essentially the person funding the project instead of directly making it herself, so she's not that involved in the show as is, and Toby Fox, who's voicing the main character, John Egbert, and of course contributing to the music because it's Toby Fox we're talking about. And for those not in the loop, both Vivziepop and Toby were pretty notable figures in the early Homestuck fandom, Toby famously also having composed a shit ton of music for it, and even doing some animation work if I'm not mistaken. The crew here isn't jarring in that they'd be interested in doing a Homestuck themed project, but rather it's jarring that they're collaborating with Homestuck Corp specifically. To summarize, one of Homestuck's old controversies surrounded a Kickstarter Andrew Hussie made for the sake of making a Homestuck video game, essentially. The funding goal was met with overwhelming success, but backers were left in the dark for years, to the point most started to believe it was just a sunk cost and nothing would come of it. The Homestuck game, now called Hiveswap, eventually came out, and despite its original trailers and teasers being 3D, the full game was 2D, with missing credit sequence at time of release, and music composed by Toby Fox and James Roach, which I've been obsessed with since. Not a bad game by any means, but everything surrounding it was very, very strange. Now, I have to preface the following with a big, emphasized allegedly, because of reasons. What I'm going to summarize from here on out is reporting from Geo, a prominent member in the Homestuck fandom who generally does games and internet journalism, who will sadly show up later in the timeline of events as well. So, to quickly recap his article of Hiveswap's alleged rocky development, the original plan was to have the Homestuck team, at the time called What Pumpkin, design the game while a third party actually programs and develops it. This fell through for complicated reasons, and the focus instead shifted to creating a new company for the sole purpose of creating Hiveswap from the ground up. This company was called What Pumpkin New York City, and their focus was, as previously stated, on a 3D version of the game. Allegedly, the first part of the game was in a playable, albeit not perfectly polished state by the end of 2015, and the team began working slowly on the second part. Then they got fired right before Christmas with no severance pay. Allegedly. Hiveswap was once again built from the ground up with a completely different style, but unlike last time, no developmental hiccups or issues were cited as reason why. We, frankly, don't know the reason why Hiveswap switched from 3D to 2D only after the 3D version got into a playable state. The decision is broadly credited to upper management, but since no one has directly taken responsibility, and the workers who made these alleged claims don't want to point a singular finger at any singular person, it's sort of fallen to the wayside of shitty things that happened under the Homestuck name. But it shouldn't be forgotten. This alleged mass firing and lack of work crediting is extremely scummy, to say the least. There's also the fact that all of this was funded with Kickstarter money, and several of the stretch goals that were promised were never delivered on. Backers being allowed to beta test several translations of the game, Linux support, not delivered on to this day. The game's first chapter has been out for 8 years now. Sometime later, a larger creator on YouTube named Sarah Zed would publish a Homestuck retrospective video in which she described the history of the comic, its fandom, and its many ups and downs, including the Kickstarter campaign and the fallout as was documented in Geo's articles. Sarah would then be threatened with a frivolous lawsuit by the Homestuck Corporation over her citing Geo's article as a source. I am not kidding. If you want the full story, please watch Sarah's own video about it, but I need to emphasize that the Homestuck Corporation has allegedly been notorious for using legal threats as an attempt to silence and scare people into submission. It happened with Sarah Zed, though she was able to fight back because she's part of an organized creator collective, and recently, it also happened to Geo. Part 2, the Unofficial Homestuck Collection. The reason Geo is notable in the Homestuck fandom isn't just because of his coverage of this series of controversies. He contributed to something arguably much more important: the Unofficial Homestuck collection, a comprehensive archive of all things Homestuck that was nearly lost to the sands of time. For all those not in the loop, the original Homestuck comic was hosted completely online and completely for free on a site that used to be called MS Paint Adventures, and it heavily featured Flash animations and Flash games as part of its narrative. Homestuck was a direct byproduct of that era of the internet and web animation, and the death of Flash meant the comic's readability, its existence as a piece of media, was under threat. I was there when this was going on, man. Most of the Homestucks were fucking petrified. While Homestuck, the website, was sold to Viz Media for maintaining, along with the publishing rights for the Homestuck books, they didn't keep any of the Flash game segments in their original formats, nor did they go to any lengths to preserve them in any way that was good. The Flash animations were uploaded in lower qualities than fan uploads from the bygone era, and the playable game segments were just utterly butchered, turning intermissions that used to be about exploring the world into yet more walls of text. Which, yeah, is funny in the sense that Homestuck is already nothing but walls of text, but it ruins what used to be a multimedia interactable narrative into, God, whatever the fuck this is. Enter the Unofficial Homestuck collection. Made by Geo and Bambosh, it was an offline file browser made specifically for the purpose of reading the MS Paint Adventure comics in their authentic forms, Flash games and all. I seriously cannot recommend it enough. It is the best way to read Homestuck in the current day, getting as close as possible to the original experience of the comic. And then Hussey's company tried to sue Geo over it, after endorsing it publicly. Once again, I'm going to have to summarize a very lengthy article by Geo reporting on his experiences, and I highly recommend reading the entire thing if you're curious, just so you can glimpse the madness yourself. But in short, what started as a genuine effort for collaboration quickly devolved into demands to sign NDAs that were never provided, and demands to take down articles that reported on Homestuck Corp's past bullshit. They were directly trying to silence Geo and his findings by leveraging the Unofficial Homestuck collection as something they wanted to help with, but in actuality barely contributed to. Their hosting of the collection was incomplete and unusable for a while, lacking the asset pack that made the collection actually work. The legal fiasco around all this eventually resulted in Geo taking down the webpage for the Unofficial Homestuck collection. As Homestuck Corp defendants often point out, the collection is technically still available. You can find the GitHub page for the Geo fork as of writing this, but that might still change. And whether the collection is available or not is just a weapon that is being used by Homestuck Corp. This is less about, well, technically you can still read the comic, and more about the vindictive way the official Homestuck team has time and time again went after Geo specifically, and the people who so much as cite him as a source because he had the audacity to report on what actually happened during Hiveswap's development. Information that Homestuck Corp owed to their Kickstarter backers, but refused to give until a large creator like Sarah Zed covered the controversy. I hope this puts into perspective what's really going on here. Homestuck Corp is, allegedly, not only terrible with handling their staff, but is vindictive and unforgiving towards people who are critical of them, to any degree, using their ownership of the Homestuck IP as a silencing tactic rather than to support the fan base that formed around it. Nearly all of this is often attributed to Hussey specifically, since he acts as a supervisor for Homestuck Corp and its many forms. This pilot is the nail in the coffin that confirms that, no matter how much Hussey claims to have moved on from Homestuck and not be involved with any future projects, he's absolutely still trying to get involved. On the one hand, you could argue he's well within his right. He is the one that wrote the damn thing. But on the other hand, if you read the Homestuck epilogues, you'll know how much emphasis Hussey placed on canonicity being mute in all further Homestuck iterations. Homestuck Squared was supposed to be a fan continuation of the comic post its ending, but its troubled development pointed to a frequent switching of writing teams, probably spearheaded by Hussey himself, who provided them with story pointers that restricted what they may have wanted to do instead of fully letting it be beyond canon. Ugh. A Homestuck media rant aside, if you're at all interested in reading Homestuck as the original piece of influential work that it was, use the Unofficial collection. As long as you're aware of why the collection itself doesn't have a bespoke landing page made by the people who actually made the damn thing. All of this is extra tragic because, to this day, the official Viz Media Homestuck website is still unusable. Hussey went to pseudo-legal war with the fans trying to preserve the comic as authentically as possible, while the people he sold the property to are letting it rot in an untended-to website. Part 3. Dubious Partnerships. Something I find kind of tragic is that Ju's article used some memes spawned in Deltarune as comic relief in between the hellfire that was this entire situation. And now, a literal day after those articles came out, the face of Deltarune himself is involved in a Homestuck corporate project that is very easily going to be used as a cover-up for the UHC situation. Once again, I need to restate, I don't think anyone involved in this project is bad because they're associating with the Homestuck Corporation. Rather, it's Homestuck Corp that has a history of lying to people they trust about the problems they themselves cause, and undermining the work of people who don't have large enough platforms to call them out on it. Allegedly. Just like with James Roach, I think Toby Fox as an artist, Homestuck Corporation keeps in its good graces because of the Just like with James Roach, I think Toby Fox is an artist the Homestuck Corporation keeps in its good graces, both because of his history with Homestuck the webcomic, and because he's a large and notable creator that can bring more good PR rather than bad PR. Toby is no stranger to Homestuck controversies too. He was active on the Homestuck forums that were killed in 2016. He was directly involved in the fandom wang scandals like The Baby Is You, just don't ask. And I sincerely doubt that he didn't hear anything about the Hive Swap fiasco. The only thing we don't know is what he heard. And as I already said, the most likely option is that he was lied to by Hussey and the others. They have a set precedent for doing that. But I also need people to be okay with the idea that Toby knew and didn't act on it. He could have just as easily taken a voice acting gig for a franchise he has history with, even if he knew the people involved aren't super trustworthy. This is a thing people do sometimes, and I don't want people vilifying him and equating him to Hussey when the most he's done is turn a blind eye. At the end of the day, Homestuck Corp is at fault for what allegedly happened to their employees. Furthermore, I think a team like Vivziepop's should have been more vigilant at the kinds of people they're willing to do close collaborations with like this, as her studios have already been under fire for accusations of mistreating their staff. Whether these have as much credence to them as the Homestuck accusations, I personally can't verify, as I am merely a Homestuck and Undertale scholar, and the Helliverse controversy deep lore is a little above my pay grade. Similarly, I find it ironic that a creator like Vivziepop, who's very vocal about how her ostracization from online communities over what she perceives as petty infighting has negatively affected her on a daily basis, has partnered with someone like Hussey, who is the kind of person to cut someone off and ruin their life over petty infighting. Allegedly. This is generally just a wild team up on paper. The woman who specializes in early 2010s alternative style adult animation and made her own animation studios from the ground up has partnered with notoriously vindictive and uncooperative comic hermit Andrew Hussey and fandom beloved composer and game creator Toby motherfucking Fox to make an animated pilot for a webcomic that was always meant to be just a product of its time. Can we just take a moment to think about that? I know I've been very serious throughout this entire video, but I just need a fucking minute. What do you mean there's hell of a boss and Homestuck crossover merch now? What fucking timeline are we living in? Ugh. Bonus part, the art nerd rambles. This entire section is just for me and my personal opinions about this pilot, so skip to this timestamp if you don't give a shit. Since Homestuck is already an animated medium of sorts, a lot of people in the fandom tossed around the idea of a Homestuck animated series since the early days. It's notable, to me, that none of these were ever treated with too much gravity back in the day. Fan animation projects were always a big deal, but a fully fledged Homestuck cartoon was never seen as feasible. It was more about taking your favorite characters and trying to see what they'd look like in a different medium, with different styles, tropes, and expectations. Homestuck, as a story, doesn't lend itself to a conventional animation very well, or any other medium but its native webcomic format. This is most obvious in the Homestuck books, of which I regrettably own several, where the lengthy bits of dialogue and narration span pages and pages, and author commentary is given as a bonus selling point to, in my opinion, make up for the fact that the books' formatting is bad graphic design by design. Homestuck wasn't made for this kind of presentation, and the story and dialogue can't easily be translated to another medium. The trailer for the pilot looks thrilling, or at least attempts to be, but please keep in mind that Homestuck, at its core, isn't a talk and walk like most cartoons are, it's just talk. The animations in the original comic were silent, at least dialogue-wise, and the small animations that accompanied the dialogue chains were minimalistic. You kind of can't have your cake and eat it too with Homestuck. Characters are either talking or moving the plot along, very rarely at the same time. All this to say, I think the pilot is going to be weirdly paced. The more recent fan projects for a fully fledged Homestuck animation, like Project S, sought to circumvent this by not undoing the Pestalog format, but rather translating it verbatim into characters talking on their computers with each other, visually showing both sides of the conversation while putting the overt emphasis on characters and their actual spoken dialogue rather than the visuals. This is as fine of a compromise as you can have in this situation. Again, I'm of the opinion that translating Homestuck to any other medium is a bad idea, but if you're going to do it, you either need to be extremely faithful to its original format, or extremely deviant from it. The pilot seems to do neither. It's in this awkward middle ground between late Homestuck style of character proportions and Homestuck's early comic designs, which don't mesh together that well. The OG black and white designs are visually not complicated because they had a limited color palette and limited space. The panels were web-friendly GIF images with limited compression, meaning a smaller color palette was literally necessary in order to have something that wasn't incomprehensible to look at. But in an animated show of this scale, there's no reason not to add more color or flair to the designs, especially knowing what Spindlehorse usually animates. I guess it's that faithfulness thing I was talking about, but if that's the case, why aren't the characters stubbier and goofier to maintain faithfulness to what made the early comic style work? Why do they look like generically cartoonified versions of the characters instead of actually stylizing them to fit the new medium? Who posed Rose like this? I'm gonna cut this section off here before I get any pettier, Jesus Christ. Conclusion. As much as I want to regress to my baby Homestuck phase and just be excited for anything new and official that comes out, that's not really an option anymore. The Homestuck Corporation is allegedly untrustworthy and antagonistic both towards its employees as well as anyone they deem not valid anymore. At the end of the day, the best case scenario for the pilot is that the animators get paid and there's no production issues and upper management doesn't try to legally pursue anyone who badmouths them, but there isn't a lot of precedent for that. If you're a fan of Deltarune and Toby Fox's work in general, keep enjoying it. Even if he may have been inspired and shaped by Homestuck to a degree, you won't find answers to his game's mysteries within an old webcomic, and you certainly won't find it within anything new Homestuck Corp releases. If you're a fan of Hell of a Boss or Has Been Hotel, or both, I politely ask that you consider boycotting the Homestuck pilot, and not buying any of the merch that comes along with it. Not because of any animosity towards the animators or even Vivziepop herself, but because the corporation they've partnered with could very easily abuse the power they have to hurt people they don't want talking about them, which can include their own collaborators and employees, just as they've allegedly done in the past. A part of the Homestuck fandom is already moving towards ceasing support of the IP holders, and I invite you to help us do that. And lastly, if you're a Homestuck fan like me, keep out a vigilant eye. Preserve the original comic how you can, maintain the online community we've built, and don't let official Homestuck sources dictate what it means to be part of this fandom. Homestuck, the comic, always has and always will be something special, but the Homestuck Collective has time and time again fucked over its own IP for the sake of its own bizarro interests. It's no longer about celebrating Homestuck and making it something bigger than itself, it's about giving Hussey a new thing to glorify himself with, and new ways to fuck over the people actually putting in the legwork to preserve what's left of Homestuck. When the comic ended, and within the epilogues of the story that were released thereafter, Hussey tried to explore the idea of dubious canon. What does the author's word mean once the story is over? What happens to a narrative post-mortem, after its ending? And why are other people drawn to keep the story going past its expiration date? The gritty aftermath and the textbook happily ever after, meat and candy, existing in tandem as two branching paths that go outside the notion of canon, because canon ended when the credits rolled. The epilogues failed to properly dissect their themes, for a myriad of reasons, but the metatextual one being that the author never left. Homestuck is radioactive, not because its fandom is uniquely cruel, but because the author who frames himself as God King is. His severed hand still rests on the input keyboard, dishing out commands and demands to everyone trying to move on and create something new. We are not beyond canon. This is still Andrew's canon, and we need to distance ourselves from it. Okay, I have to release a last-minute addendum to this video because it's literally almost midnight. I'm almost done editing and captioning everything, and then Homestuck releases a fucking announcement out of nowhere that they're remodeling the website, redoing everything. So just to get all the information straight so that I'm not spreading misinformation here. First of all, the Homestuck website is no longer owned by Viz Media, apparently. I wasn't even aware of this, but apparently it happened in 2023. Explains why the website has been such a wreck since. Part 2, apparently there's one dev working on making the website usable. I'm not 100% sure. 3, they're making an official Discord. Don't join the official Discord. 4, part of their statement that they just released seems like a direct jab at Geo and Bambosh, but I'm not going to comment on that. And 5, Hussey goes exclusively by they, them pronouns now, I guess. I wasn't aware of this when I was making the video because they didn't have their pronouns fucking anywhere, so for anyone watching this video, just pretend I used the correct pronouns for Hussey this entire time, because I genuinely, I thought anything was free game. Okay, anyway, that's my update. I pray to God they don't release anything in the 5 minutes it's going to take for me to upload this fucking video, Jesus Christ.